At 4 p.m. on a foggy afternoon in July 1942, a woman in Oakland, California, walked out into her backyard to take her laundry off the line. She had a basket of white sheets and pillowcases that had been drying in the summer sun. She didn't hear the engine at first because the wind was coming off the bay, but she felt the vibration. It started as a hum in the ground and quickly grew into a roar that rattled the windows in their frames. Before she could look up, a shadow fell over her garden. A massive twin-engine aircraft screamed over her roof, flying so low that the wash from its propellers hit her like a physical slap. The wind from the engines tore the sheets off the line, scattering wet laundry all over the dirt and the grass. The plane didn't pull up. It banked hard, its silver wings flashing in the sun, and headed straight for the Golden Gate Bridge. The pilot inside the cockpit was Second Lieutenant Richard Bong, and he was having the time of his life. He was 21 years old, a farm kid from Wisconsin who treated a 7-ton fighter plane like it was a tractor he had taken for a joyride. He wasn't flying a normal pattern. He was looping the Golden Gate Bridge, diving under the span and pulling up over the cables, buzzing the frantic commuters on the deck. He waved at the tourists. He tipped his wings at the terrified pedestrians. To Richard Bong, this wasn't reckless endangerment. It was practice. He was testing the limits of the P-38 Lightning, a plane that everyone said was too big, too heavy, and too complicated for a rookie to handle. But the Army Air Force didn't see it that way. They didn't see a prodigy. They saw a clown. When Bong landed back at Hamilton Field, the military police were waiting for him on the tarmac. They didn't salute. They escorted him straight to the office of Major General George Kenney. Kenney was a hard-nosed, no-nonsense commander who chewed cigars and ate lieutenants for breakfast. He looked at the report on his desk. It contained complaints from the Bridge Authority, the police, and one very angry housewife in Oakland who wanted someone to pay for her dirty laundry. Kenney looked at Bong. He saw a kid with a round baby face who looked like he should still be bagging groceries, not flying the most advanced interceptor in the American arsenal. The general didn't scream. He just pointed at the door. He told Bong to go to Oakland. He told him to find the woman's house, and he told him to wash every single sheet he had blown into the mud. Bong did it. He scrubbed the laundry, apologized to the woman, and returned to base with his ears burning. The other pilots laughed until they couldn't breathe. They called him Bing Bong. They called him a menace. They wrote him off as a washout waiting to happen, the kind of pilot who would crash on takeoff or get shot down in his first week because he didn't respect the rules. The experts agreed. The flight instructors agreed. Richard Bong was undisciplined. He was wild. And in the Pacific Theater where they were heading, being wild didn't get you a medal. It got you dead. The Japanese pilots waiting in New Guinea weren't angry housewives. They were veterans who had been killing Americans since Pearl Harbor. In late 1942, the sky over the Pacific belonged to one machine, the Mitsubishi Zero. It was a ghost. It was made of lightweight duralumin, cloth, and paper. It had no armor plating. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was built for one thing only, agility. A Zero could turn on a dime. It could dance circles around any American fighter in the sky. If you tried to turn with a Zero, you died. It was simple physics. The Japanese plane weighed half as much as the American planes. It could loop inside their turns and put a 20mm cannon shell right into the cockpit before the American pilot even knew he was in a fight. The flight manuals were terrified of the Zero. Every briefing started and ended with the same warning. Never dogfight a Zero. The instructions were rigid. You were supposed to stay high, dive fast, take a shot, and run away. They called it boom and zoom. It was a tactic born out of fear. It admitted that the American planes were inferior in a fair fight. The experts said that if a Zero got on your tail, you were already a corpse. You couldn't shake him. You couldn't outturn him. You could only pray that your engine had enough horsepower to outrun him in a dive. This was the reality that Richard Bong flew into when he arrived in New Guinea. The morale was low. The wrecks of American P-39s and P-40s littered the jungle floor, smoking monuments to pilots who had tried to play the turning game and lost. And then there was Bong's plane. The P-38 Lightning was a freak. It didn't look like a fighter. It looked like a science experiment gone wrong. It had 2 fuselages, 2 engines, and a central pod where the pilot sat like an egg in a basket. The Germans called it the fork-tailed devil, but the American mechanics just called it a headache. It was huge. It was heavy. It was complex. It burned fuel like a battleship. Compared to the tiny, elegant Zero, the P-38 felt like a dump truck. The experts in the officers' mess looked at the P-38 and shook their heads. They said it was too big to fight. They said the twin engines made it a massive target. They said you couldn't see behind you because of the engines blocking your view. But the biggest problem wasn't the size. It was the doctrine. The rulebook said you had to fly the P-38 like a P-40. You had to respect the Zero's turn radius. You had to be conservative. But Richard Bong wasn't conservative. He sat in his tent in the humid, mosquito-infested jungle of New Guinea looking at the technical diagrams of his plane. He looked at the Zero specs. He looked at the P-38 specs. And he noticed something the people writing the manuals had missed, or maybe they hadn't missed it. Maybe they were just too scared to use it. The secret was in the nose. Every other American fighter, the P-51, the P-47, the P-40, had its guns mounted in the wings. This was standard design. You put 3 machine guns on the left wing and 3 on the right. But this created a math problem called convergence. The bullets came out of the wings wide apart. They had to be angled inward so they would cross at a specific distance, usually 300 yards. If the enemy was at 300 yards, he got hit by all 6 guns. But if he was at 100 yards, the bullets would pass on either side of him. If he was at 500 yards, the bullets would spread out and miss. You had to be at the perfect distance to kill. You had to think about geometry while someone was shooting at you. The P-38 was different because the engines were on the booms. The nose was empty. So the engineers packed the guns right in front of the pilot. 4.50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all clustered together in a space the size of a kitchen table. When you pulled the trigger in a P-38, the bullets didn't converge. They didn't cross. They flew straight out in a solid column of lead like a laser beam. They stayed together for nearly a mile. There was no sweet spot. If you could get your nose on the target, you didn't just poke holes in it. You erased it. Bong sat on his cot, sweating in the tropical heat, and realized what this meant. It meant he didn't have to get close. It meant he didn't have to turn. It meant he could do the one thing the manual said was suicide. He could fly head-on. The manual screamed against it. A head-on pass with a Zero was considered a death sentence. The closing speed was over 600 miles per hour. You had less than 2 seconds to aim. And if you flew straight at a Zero, you were flying straight at 2 cannon barrels that could shatter your windscreen and turn your head into red mist. The Japanese pilots loved head-on passes because they were fearless. They believed their spirit was stronger than American steel. They would play chicken until the American pilot flinched and broke away. And the moment the American broke away, he exposed his belly and the Zero would gut him. But the Japanese pilots were used to fighting planes with wing guns. They knew the American bullets were spread out. They knew they could slip through the gap if they got close enough. They didn't know about the P-38's nose. They didn't know that Bong was sitting behind a buzz saw that didn't spread out. Bong decided to stop washing laundry and start rewriting the book. He decided that the next time he saw a Zero, he wasn't going to dive. He wasn't going to run. He was going to point his nose directly at the enemy's propeller and hold the trigger down until one of them turned into debris. The other pilots thought he was crazy. They told him the Zero would chew him up. They told him the Japanese didn't have fear genes. Bong didn't argue. He just climbed into his cockpit, checked his magnetos, and taxied out to the coral runway. He was ready to test his theory. The clown from the Golden Gate Bridge was about to go to work. To understand why Richard Bong's plan was considered crazy, you have to understand the machine he was strapping himself into. The P-38 Lightning was a monster. In a world of single-engine, elegant dogfighters, the P-38 was a flying brickyard. It weighed nearly 8 tons fully loaded. It had 2 Allison V12 engines that screamed like banshees and drank gas like a hole in the ground. It was so big you could park a Jeep under the wings. When you sat in the cockpit, you weren't sitting in a fighter plane. You were perched in a tiny pod suspended between two roaring power plants. The noise was deafening, a physical vibration that rattled your teeth and blurred your vision. It didn't feel like a scalpel, felt like a sledgehammer. And in 1942, sledgehammers were not supposed to chase butterflies. The Zero was the butterfly, light, fragile, and impossible to catch. The experts looked at the P-38 and saw a laundry list of problems. They said it couldn't turn tight enough. They said it was too visible. They said if you lost an engine on takeoff, the torque would flip you over and drive you into the ground like a lawn dart. But they were looking at the plane all wrong. They were trying to fly it like it was a P-40 or a Wildcat. They were trying to play the Zeros game. Richard Bong wasn't interested in the Zeros game. He was interested in the P-38's secret weapon, a feature that looked boring on paper but was terrifying in practice. The nose. In almost every other American fighter plane, the guns were mounted in the wings. This was a massive engineering headache. Imagine trying to shoot a target while holding a pistol in your left hand and another in your right, with your arms stretched as wide as they can go. To hit something in front of you, you have to angle your wrists inward. The bullets travel in two separate lines that cross each other at a specific point in front of your face. This is called convergence. It sounds scientific, but in a chaotic dogfight, it's a nightmare. If your guns are set to cross at 300 yards, you have to be exactly 300 yards away to hit with full power. If the enemy is too close, say 100 yards, the bullets from your left wing fly past his left ear and the bullets from your right wing fly past his right ear. You create a safe zone right in front of your nose where the enemy can fly through your fire without getting scratched. This convergence problem forced pilots to be mathematicians. They had to judge distance perfectly while pulling G-forces that made their blood heavy. They had to think about angles. They had to walk the bullets onto the target. It was sloppy. It wasted ammo. And against a pilot as skilled as a Japanese naval aviator, sloppy meant dead. A Zero pilot wouldn't give you time to do the math. He would slip inside your convergence point where your bullets couldn't touch him, and he would tear you apart. The P-38 didn't have this problem because the engines were out on the booms. The nose of the plane was empty. The engineers didn't put radar or luggage in there. They packed it with hate. They mounted 4.50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon right in the center, directly in front of the pilot's feet. This changed everything. When you fired a P-38, you weren't crossing the streams. You were firing a solid, concentrated column of lead straight down the centerline. It was like holding a fire hose. It didn't matter if the target was 50 yards away or 1,000 yards away. The bullets traveled parallel to each other. There was no safe zone. There was no math. If you could see it in your sight, you could kill it. It was point and click. Bong realized that this technical detail was the key to unlocking the suicide run. The manual said never go head-on with a Zero because the Zero had two cannons in its wings. But the Zero suffered from the same convergence problem as the American planes. For the Japanese pilot to hit Bong in a head-on pass, he had to guess the range perfectly. He had to wait until Bong was at the exact distance where his wing guns crossed. If he fired too early, his shots would go wide. If he fired too late, he would crash. The Japanese pilot had to wait. He had to hold his fire. Bong didn't have to wait. With his guns clustered in the nose, he could open fire from a mile away. He could create a wall of metal that the Zero had to fly through. It was a game of chicken, but one driver had a sniper rifle and the other had a shotgun. Bong knew he could start shooting 5 seconds before the Japanese pilot could even think about pulling the trigger. He could vaporize the enemy before he was even in range of the Zero's guns. It wasn't suicide. It was an execution. But knowing it in a tent and doing it in the sky were two different things. The first test came in late December over the steamy jungles of Buna. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation. Bong was flying a patrol, his engines humming a deep, throbbing rhythm, when he spotted them. A flight of Japanese Val dive bombers escorted by Zeros. The enemy planes looked like silver flakes of ash floating against the green mountains. Standard doctrine said to climb above them, dive on the bombers, take a quick shot, and run for home. The Zeros were waiting for him to try it. They were circling like sharks, waiting for the clumsy American twin-engine plane to make a mistake. Bong didn't climb. He didn't run. He turned his heavy control yoke and pointed the nose of the Lightning directly at the lead Japanese formation. It was an unnatural feeling. Every survival instinct in a pilot's brain screams at you not to fly straight at another object moving 300 miles per hour. The closing speed was insane, over 600 miles per hour combined. The gap between the planes didn't just close. It vanished. The Japanese planes grew from dots to distinct shapes in a heartbeat. You could see the red circles on their wings. You could see the canopy glass. The Japanese pilots must have been confused. They were used to Americans who panicked. They were used to Americans who turned away at the last second to protect their engines. They saw this big twin-tailed bathtub flying straight down their throats and probably thought the pilot was already dead or asleep. They held their course, waiting for the convergence, waiting for the moment to snap roll and gut the American. They were waiting for a game that Bong wasn't playing. At long range, a distance where wing guns would be useless, Bong squeezed the trigger. The nose of the P-38 erupted. The vibration of 5 heavy weapons firing at once was enough to slow the plane down in midair. Smoke streamed back over the canopy. A solid cone of tracer fire lashed out like a whip. There was no walking the rounds. There was no uncertainty. The stream of lead hammered into the lead Japanese plane. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The Zero wasn't built to take punishment. It was a kite made of magnesium and pride. It had no armor plate to stop a .50 caliber round, let alone a 20mm cannon shell. The American rounds didn't just punch holes. They disassembled the aircraft. The wall of lead hit the Zero's engine block and shredded it. Tore the wings off the spar. The enemy plane didn't spin down. It simply dissolved. 1 second it was a terrifying war machine. The next it was a cloud of burning gasoline and aluminum confetti. Bong flew right through the debris field, hearing the sharp clatter of scrap metal hitting his own wings. He didn't stop. He pulled the yoke back, using the massive momentum of the heavy P-38 to zoom back up into the clouds. He looked back. The burning wreckage was tumbling into the jungle canopy. It worked. The math held up. The experts who told him never to go head-on were thinking about dogfights. Bong wasn't dogfighting. He was jousting with a lance that was 3 times longer than his enemy's. When he landed, the adrenaline was still shaking his hands, but his face was a mask of calm. The ground crew swarmed the plane, checking for damage. They found soot on the nose and scratches on the paint from debris, but not a single bullet hole. The suicide run hadn't just worked. It had kept him safer than any turning fight ever could. The word started to spread through the barracks. The clown had cracked the code. The other pilots stopped making jokes about his laundry run. They started asking about sight pictures. They started asking about trigger discipline. Bong didn't brag. He wasn't the type to stand on a table and tell war stories. He was quiet. He spent his time tinkering with his engine settings, trying to get a few extra miles per hour out of the Allisons. He treated the war like a factory job. He punched in, he killed Zeros, and he punched out. But the command noticed. General Kenny, the man who had chewed him out, started reading the combat reports with a raised eyebrow. The kid was racking up kills, and he wasn't doing it by getting lucky. He was doing it by systematically violating the safety manual. The escalation was rapid. The Japanese command in Rabaul realized something was changing. Their pilots, the samurai of the sky who had terrorized the Pacific for a year, were not coming back. They weren't reporting glorious dogfights. They were just disappearing. The Americans were getting bolder. They weren't running away anymore. They were turning into the fight. The psychological impact was massive. The Zero relied on fear. It relied on the enemy making a mistake out of panic. But you couldn't scare a P-38 that was hurling a brick wall of bullets at your face. By early 1943, Richard Bong was an ace. He had 5 kills, then 6, then 8. He was destroying the myth of the invincible Zero one head-on pass at a time. But the Japanese weren't done. They were planning something massive. They were gathering a convoy of ships, troop transports, and destroyers to reinforce their stronghold at La. They were going to flood New Guinea with thousands of fresh troops to push the Americans back into the sea. And to protect this convoy, they were assembling a massive umbrella of fighters. The intelligence reports started trickling in. A huge movement of enemy shipping was detected in the Bismarck Sea. It was the biggest target the 5th Air Force had ever seen. It was also the most dangerous. The sky would be black with zeros. The experts warned that the P-38s would be outnumbered. They warned that trying to attack the ships while fighting off the fighter cover was a suicide mission. They said the pilots would be swarmed. Bong checked his guns. He checked his engines. He knew what was coming. This wasn't going to be a skirmish over a few bombers. This was going to be a brawl. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was about to begin, and Richard Bong was about to prove that his stupid idea could sink an entire navy. The kid who had blown laundry off a clothesline was about to fly into the teeth of the Japanese Empire, and he was bringing his wall of lead with him. The manuals were about to be rewritten in smoke and fire. March of 1943 brought a storm to the Bismarck Sea, but it wasn't made of rain and wind. It was made of steel and gasoline. The Japanese High Command had gambled everything on a massive convoy, 8 destroyers and 8 troop transports carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers to reinforce their stronghold in New Guinea. If those troops landed, the war in the Pacific would drag on for another bloody year. The ocean below churned with gray ships, their decks packed with men and equipment. Above them, the sky was infested. The Japanese had sent every available fighter plane to protect the convoy. Zeros swarmed angrily around the slow-moving ships like hornets defending a hive. They knew the Americans were coming. They knew the stakes, and they were ready to die to keep those ships afloat. Richard Bong was flying lead in a flight of P-38s when the convoy appeared on the horizon. It looked like a toy set floating in a bathtub, tiny gray shapes cutting white wakes through blue water. But the dots swarming above them were not toys. They were the elite of the Japanese Navy. The experts back at base had warned this would be a slaughter. They said the P-38s would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They said the Zeros would drag the heavy American planes down to low altitude, where the air was thick and the P-38 was sluggish, and chop them into pieces. The manual said to stay high. It said to drop bombs and run. It said to avoid dogfights at all costs. Richard Bong looked at the swarm of Zeros and threw the manual out the window. He didn't climb for safety. He didn't look for an exit strategy. He shoved the throttles forward to war emergency power. The twin Allison engines roared in protest, drinking fuel at a rate that would drain the tanks in an hour but pouring raw horsepower into the propellers. The P-38 shuddered as it surged past 300, then 350 miles per hour. Bong wasn't looking for a straggler. He was looking for a fight. He spotted a formation of Zeros diving to intercept a group of American B-25s. Their pilots were fixated on easy kills. They didn't see the silver demon dropping out of the sun behind them, or maybe they did and didn't care. The standard American tactic was boom and zoom, dive, shoot, and pull up. It was safe. It was smart. Kept you alive, but it rarely killed the enemy. Bong didn't want to scare them. He wanted to erase them. He leveled off in the middle of the enemy formation. He didn't zoom away. He turned directly into the swarm. It was like walking into a bar fight and locking the door behind you. The radio chatter was chaos, screams, warnings, target callouts. But inside Bong's cockpit the world narrowed to a single visual cone. He picked a target. A Zero painted in dark green naval camouflage was banking hard to line up a B-25. Bong banked with him. The P-38 groaned under the G-forces. The metal skin of the wings flexed. The heavy engines fought the turn. But Bong wrestled the yoke with both hands and forced the fighter to do something it wasn't supposed to do. He made it dance. The Zero pilot saw him and broke off his attack. This was the moment. This was the suicide scenario. The Zero was light, nimble, and armed with cannons. The P-38 was a flying tank. They turned nose to nose, closing at a speed that blurred the ocean below. The Japanese pilot likely smiled. He knew the script. He believed the American would panic and break away at the last second. Then the Zero would pivot and rake the P-38's belly with 20mm shells. It was a maneuver they had practiced endlessly. They called it spirit. They believed they could win because they didn't fear death. But Richard Bong wasn't playing chicken. He was playing math. He knew exactly what his nose-mounted guns could do. At nearly a mile away, a laughable range for most fighters, Bong pressed the trigger. The nose of the P-38 lit up. 4.50 caliber machine guns and a cannon fired in unison, sending violent vibration through the airframe. Smoke streamed past the canopy. Downrange, the wall of lead traveled forward, not as a spray but as a solid bar of metal. The Japanese pilot, waiting for convergence at 300 yards, never saw it coming. Bong hit him at 800. The rounds smashed into the Zero's engine like a sledgehammer hitting a soda can. The engine block shattered. The propeller sheared off. The unarmored fuel tanks detonated instantly. The Zero didn't fall. It exploded, a fireball brighter than the sun. Bong flew straight through the smoke and flame, heat flashing across his windscreen, soot coating his wings. He emerged on the other side trailing smoke, looking like a demon clawing its way out of hell. He checked his 6. Clear. Instruments green. He went hunting again. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a conveyor belt of violence. Bong hauled the heavy plane around and spotted another Zero climbing for altitude. Bong pulled up after him. The P-38 clawed skyward, hanging on its props. The Japanese pilot looked back in terror as the brick climbed with him. Bong fired a short, controlled burst. The rounds struck the Zero's wing root. The wing separated completely. The aircraft snapped into a violent spin and tumbled toward the ocean. Bong leveled off, chest heaving, sweat burning his eyes. The cockpit was an oven. Below him, the ocean burned. American bombers skipped bombs across the water, smashing transports apart. Ships sank. Men jumped into oil-slicked seas. The air was filled with black flak bursts and tracer fire. It was chaos. It was slaughter. And in the middle of it, Richard Bong was rewriting the aerial warfare textbook. He wasn't using finesse. He wasn't outflying the Zeros. He was outgunning them. He was using the P-38 as a battering ram. He spotted a third target, a Zero flying low, trying to strafe a downed American crew in the water. This made Bong angry. It was one thing to fight a soldier. It was another to shoot sailors swimming for their lives. Bong rolled the P-38 over and dove. The airframe screamed as it passed 400 miles per hour. The controls stiffened, becoming heavy and hard to move. This was compressibility, the aerodynamic force that could lock a P-38 in a dive and drive it straight into the ocean. The experts warned about this. They said if you dove too fast, you would lose control and die. Bong knew the limit. He felt the vibration in the stick. He felt the buffet in the tail. He rode the edge of the envelope like a surfer on a giant wave. He lined up the strafing Zero. The Japanese pilot was focused on the water, watching his bullets kick up splashes around helpless men. He never looked up. Bong didn't give him a warning. He opened fire from above, gravity aiding the rounds. The wall of leads struck the Zero from top to bottom. It punched through the canopy, through the pilot, through the floor, and through the wing spar. The Zero disintegrated in midair, snapping in half. The pieces rained harmlessly into the water beside the men the pilot had been trying to kill. Bong pulled out of the dive. The G-forces crushed him into the seat. His vision grayed at the edges as blood drained from his head. His G-suit squeezed his legs, forcing blood back to his brain. He groaned, fought the blackout, and leveled off at 500 feet. He checked his fuel. Low. He checked his ammo. Enough for maybe one more pass. But the sky was clearing. The Zeros were scattering. The convoy was burning. The impossible victory was unfolding in front of him. He turned for home, engines throbbing steadily. He looked at his hands. They were shaking again, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash. He had flown straight into the teeth of the enemy. He had ignored turn radius limits. He had ignored diving speed warnings. He had treated the P-38 not as a compromised fighter but as a weapon of brute force, and he was bringing home a pristine airplane. Back at base, the ground crews waited, counting aircraft as they returned. They saw the twin-tailed silhouette of Bong's Lightning on final approach. He touched down, tires chirping on the coral strip, and taxied to his revetment. He shut down the engines. The silence was deafening. The propellers spun to a stop. Bong sat listening to the ticking of cooling metal. He popped the canopy and climbed out. The crew chief ran up. "How was it, Lieutenant?" he asked, staring at the soot-covered gun ports. Bong wiped sweat from his forehead with a dirty glove. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He pointed to the nose. "Reload it," he said. "The job's not done." He walked toward the debrief tent, leaving the mechanics staring at the plane. They noticed the nose guns. They noticed the lack of bullet holes. They noticed the pilot walking away, parachute slung over his shoulder like a laundry bag. The mockery was gone. The jokes were finished. The experts were quiet now. They realized the kid from Wisconsin hadn't just survived the Bismarck Sea. He had clogged the grinder. He had turned a suicide tactic into slaughter. And he was just getting started. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a turning point. For Richard Bong, it was just another Tuesday. The ace of aces was rising, and the Japanese Empire was running out of pilots willing to play chicken with a ghost. By 1944, Richard Bong's name was no longer a joke in the officers' mess. It was a legend whispered from New Guinea to the Philippines. The kid who once blew laundry off a clothesline was now the deadliest predator in the Pacific. He flew without swagger. No shark teeth. No nickname. Just a painting of his girlfriend Marge on the nose of his P-38 and a job to do. To other pilots, he was a machine. He didn't seem to feel pressure. He didn't care about odds. He climbed into his twin-engine bathtub, flew straight into the enemy, and came back with empty gun belts and a boring story about another zero getting in the way. The scoreboard broke. In World War I, Eddie Rickenbacker set the American record with 26 kills. Experts said no one would ever reach it again. Richard Bong blew past it. 26 became 27, then 30, then 35. He shot down enemy planes faster than the Army could print medals. The experts who once called his tactic suicide now taught it in flight schools. They told cadets to stop turning and start shooting straight. But the Army had a problem. Bong was too valuable. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was a national asset. If he died, it would be a propaganda disaster. So they grounded him. They sent him home to shake hands and sell war bonds. Bong hated it. He was a hunter, not a salesman. He talked his way back into the cockpit by promising to instruct. Strangely, Japanese planes kept falling from the sky on those flights. He claimed self-defense. The generals added kills to the list. The final tally was 40. 40 times he flew into death and won the math problem. He became the highest-scoring American ace in history, a record that still stands. General Kenny pinned the Medal of Honor on the same man he once ordered to wash sheets. The reckless kid was now a hero. In early 1945, the Army finally stopped him. He went home. He married Marge. He was 24. He survived the deadliest air war in history without a scratch. He should have lived to 90. But fate is cruel. The jet age was beginning. The Army tested a new fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star. Fast, unstable, dangerous. They needed the best pilot alive. On August 6, 1945, Bong took off in AP-80 from Burbank. It was routine. Seconds after liftoff, the fuel pump failed. The engine flamed out. The jet became a falling dart. Too low to recover. Over homes. Bong stayed with the plane, guiding it away from houses. He tried to bail out. Too late. The jet hit and exploded. The man who survived 40 dogfights died in a test flight. His death was overshadowed. That same day, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The world changed. Bong's death became a footnote. But we don't remember him for how he died. We remember how he flew. He proved manuals are guides, not laws. He proved impossible is just opinion. He looked at a hated airplane and saw a winning weapon. The P-38 is gone. The zeros are gone. But the lesson remains. When experts laugh. When rules say you'll die. Remember the kid from Wisconsin. Remember the wall of lead. Sometimes the only way to win is to point your nose into danger and refuse to blink.